The photograph you're looking at is of George Kiefer Brewer. And George was born on the 5th day of January in 1914 in Woolstock, Iowa. Now most people recognize him, of course, as George Reeves, or Superman from the old 1950s TV series, The Adventures of Superman. Now George's parents divorced soon after he was born, and his mother, Helen, eventually moved her and George to California to live with her sister. Soon after that, though, she remarried. George's father, Don Brewer, remarried also, and he had other kids. Unfortunately, after that, he never contacted young George again. But now him and his mother remained close for the rest of his life. George attended Pasadena High School while in California, where he became interested in acting and in high school plays. Somehow or another, he managed to be accepted into the famous Pasadena Playhouse. And in 1935, George was discovered and offered his first real acting part. It was a small part, but it was in a large movie, David O. Selznick's Gone with the Wind, which starred, of course, Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable. George was one of the many suitors of Scarlett O'Hara, and his part was in the first part of the movie. After Gone with the Wind, he managed several more supporting roles. And in the meantime, on September the 22nd in 1940, he met and married Eleanora Needles. She was an aspiring actor, and they remained married for 10 years. They divorced around 1950, which was 1 year before he got his famous role as Superman on television. Now, during World War II, George landed his first starring role in 1943 in the movie called So Proudly We Hail. George played a wounded soldier in World War II that falls in love with Claudette Colbert. And about that time, George was actually drafted into the military and assigned to do training films for the war effort. Now, after the war, parts were harder to find for all actors because all the studios, of course, were cutting back on productions. He struggled through until his big break in 1951 when he won the part of TV's Superman. Superman ran all the way to 1957, making George Reeves a household name. George believed that his role as Superman was both a blessing and a curse. He was able to make money, of course, from the show's episodes and by doing personal appearances. And he was more famous than he could have ever hoped to have been. However, he believed himself to be typecast as Superman, which he thought hurt his acting career and ability to get good parts. Now, there were conflicting reports that George drank a lot and was depressed because of his not being able to shake off the Superman image. However, others, including his mother, said that wasn't so, that George was in good spirits because he was going to get married in just a few days, and he had been asked to star in a new series that was coming up as Superman. They was going to give him a much higher salary plus greater input into the series. Police reports stated that sometime between the hours of 1:30 and 2 a.m. on the morning of 16 June 1959, in his upstairs bedroom at the home located at 1579 Benedict Canyon Drive, George Reeves died from a single gunshot wound to his right temple. Now, they also stated that the police was not called for 45 minutes after his death, and that there were no eyewitnesses to the actual shooting. They found Reeves naked, laying back on the bed with his feet on the floor as if he had been sitting on the edge of the bed when the shot was fired. There was also one bullet hole in the ceiling. But they believed that, being inebriated, he was slumped over and that he tilted his head when he pulled the trigger, which would cause the bullet to go through his head and into the ceiling. Now, guest at the time of the shooting was his fiancée, Leonore Lemon, also a writer by the name of William Bliss, Richard Condon, and Carol Van Rokel. Now, they may have been others there. They wasn't sure, but nobody mentioned it in the crowd. Now, the house guests, they stated that Reeves had been depressed somewhat that night because they were all heavily drinking. Although the house guests' stories did vary and they were inconsistent, the police passed it off as everybody being highly intoxicated. And of course they did find high alcoholic contents in Reeves' system. Guests stated that Reeves was already in bed when two of the guests arrived after midnight. Now, Reeves had an open door house policy for his friends, but not after midnight. Anybody come after midnight, it really irritated him. They all was aware of it. But his fiancée had mistakenly left the front porch light on, and that was a signal to his friends that they could come by and see him if the light was on. However, she enticed him to come downstairs and have a few drinks with their guest, even though he was already in bed. Now, around 1:30 in the a.m., Reeves goes back upstairs by himself, leaving Eleanor and the other guests downstairs. Now, the funny thing is that Eleanor stated, and the guest told the investigators this, that she said, well, Reeves, he's pouting now, which he often did when things didn't go right to suit him. Said that now he'll probably go upstairs and shoot himself. And after they heard a shot fire, she said, see, I told you, he shot himself, or something to that effect. Of course, she had to explain, after they told the investigators what she said, she had to explain to them that Reeves would sometimes play a sick game of Russian roulette, which he would take his gun and put in movie blanks and hold them close to his head and then pull the trigger. Of course, it wasn't close enough that would leave powder burns or that would do any damage to his face. Now, this was enough for the police to rule his death as a suicide. Although later the investigators found 2 more bullet holes in the floor in Reeves' bedroom. Now, there's a question as if it's 2 or more. But they questioned her about it, and actually the bullet holes had been covered up by a rug, and Lemon stated that she had accidentally shot the holes into the floor at an earlier date. But of course they failed to mention that while the investigators were there. Now, Reeves and his fiancée had planned to marry in just a few days. They were going to go down to Mexico, spend a few days, and then they were going all the way to Australia because kids over there really love Superman. And then they was going to stop in Spain and honeymoon in Europe. Now, this was to be a working honeymoon, which meant that he was actually going on tour for the new Superman series that was coming up. They had promised to pay him a good raise in salary and to give him say-so over some of the series. And they stated that he seemed to be really pleased and really happy with it. Now, others said that he didn't really like the idea of dressing up like Superman and playing the role, but at least this was a lot of money, and they was actually going to pay him around $20,000 to make these personal appearances. And this was only 3 days, it's supposed to happen, after his death. Now, some people who didn't believe that Reeves' death was a suicide suspected, of course, his fiancée, Lenore Lemon. She became highly upset, for one reason, after Reeves' death, because he had left his house, his automobile, and a bulk of his estate to Tony Mannix, of which he had had a not-so-secret affair with for several years. Now, Lenore Lemon left town, which is strange, just a few days after Reeves' death. She didn't even go to his funeral, and she'd ever come back to Hollywood. Lenore died on December the 30th, 1989, at the age of 66. It was common knowledge that Reeves and Tony Mannix had an affair that lasted several years, and the unusual thing about the affair was that Tony was married to Eddie Mannix, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's executive, one of their top executives. And to top it all off, some say that he knew about the affair, but he didn't care. It was considered an open marriage, and he actually, they say, liked George Reeves. Some say Tony just shared Reeves with expensive gifts such as the house that he was living in when he died. She also bought him expensive automobiles, and some say she even paid some of his bills. Now, this might be the reason that he left her all these things back in his will. Now, back to Lenore Lemon. When Reeves met Lemon, he called off the affair with Tony Mannix that he had had for so long. She became naturally irate, calling him 15 to 20 times a day, making threats, and some serious threats. It got so bad that Reeves actually went to the Beverly Hills police to try and get the threats stopped. He later on went to the LA District Attorney's office to try and get these threats stopped. Now, although Reeves dismissed as a coincidence around 3 months before his death, he barely escaped being crushed between trucks on the highway. And another time a speeding car almost crashed into him, and he dodged it. The last thing that happened was his car lost its brakes, and he did come out with some minor scrapes and injuries. One of the mechanics that investigated and looked at the car said that there was nothing mechanically wrong with the car, and somebody had actually drained the brake fluid out of the car. Some said that Tony Mannix had slipped into the Reeves bedroom when no one was home and replaced the blanks in his gun with real bullets, being that she had a key to the front door. It's been said that Tony Mannix actually kept a shrine to George Reeves in her home years after his death. Others said that she loved him so much that there was no way that she could have hurt him. Tony died in 1983 in Beverly Hills at the age of 77 with Alzheimer's. She never remarried after her husband Eddie Mannix died in 1963, and he died 4 years after George. She had no children. Now, Eddie Mannix, her husband, was also considered a suspect by a lot of Reeves' friends. It was said that he had underworld connections, and that he could get anything done he wanted. His job at the studios was, they called him the fixer. That meant that he would take care of any problems that the stars had, if it was minor to murder. Rumors even blamed him for his first wife's death, which she died in a speeding car wreck in 1937. And they said that he did it to collect insurance. However, this is highly unlikely because Eddie Mannix didn't need insurance money. There's no question he had plenty of it. Eddie died 4 years after George, and he was 72 years old. Now, Eddie was the kind of person that could actually get anything done, but I believe that when Eddie's wife died in 1937 and he married Toni, or she was more or less a common law wife, I don't think that he was so deeply in love with her that it really mattered, because he had other affairs, they say, himself, and I don't think he really cared, because I think he probably cared for his wife enough that no one really could take her place. Now, George Reeves' his mother, after his death, of course, she didn't believe that it was suicide. She hired an investigator, and they looked for several years. Actually, they was able to delay. They wanted to cremate George, but they was able to delay that for several years while they investigated. Unfortunately, the investigator and George's mother died before they could actually prove anything. Now, friends that worked with George Reeves said that he was a thoughtful, considerate Southern gentleman, although he wasn't from the South. And they give him credit for being a kind man. And at his death, George Reeves was 45 years old. Superman.